Picasso said, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. How does this approach apply to your specific field or expertise? So I work in the culinary field. I spent several years in culinary school before training to become a chef, and now I run my own kitchen with about 30 employees under me. We serve between 300 and 500 people at lunch and dinner each day. Honestly, if I hadn't gone to learn all of the basics, like how to make a simple sauce, how to base my timing, and how to season food, I never would have been able to get to a level where I'm at today. Nowadays, recipes are more just like guidelines than anything else, except for baking, of course. Basically, I'll look at what's on the menu for the day, and I'll know how to play with it and tease it and make it taste delicious while still being within the nutrient and caloric guidelines. I work for an institution that provides food that has to follow certain nutritional guidelines in order to be healthy for a clientele. Sometimes, if I get, say, a recipe for mashed potatoes, I'm knowledgeable enough of the ingredients to make substitutions on what kind of cheese I use, or the ratio of heavy whipping cream to sour cream, to stay within the nutrient guidelines but still add some flavor. Obviously, the easiest way to make a recipe taste better without messing it up is just to add some seasoning, but sometimes you have to give it a bit more love than that. I'm very fond of butter, as Julia Child said, butter makes everything taste better. But I also have to know when to refrain or when to remenu an item if I've changed it so much that the menu guidelines would no longer be accurate. It's kind of a see it thing, but I definitely don't want to lose my job because I was trying to make something taste better. You can't ever play with stuff and become an artist if you don't learn how to draw in the first place. It's one of the things I love the most about my job, that I've been doing it for long enough now that I'm able to play with it really, really well. It's taken a decade to even get to this point, and I still have so much further to go, but I'm thrilled with the progress I've made in that time alone. Yeah, cooking is a great example. You gotta know the basics, and that'll get you through a cookbook, but knowing the details is really kind of required to start improvising and turning it into an art form that you can enjoy for the rest of your life, just like OP. Story 2. In computer programming, if you know the low-level knowledge for how the computer works, you can know when to selectively ignore best practices or even basic safety measures for the sake of getting a slim optimization working. Example, a friend of mine working with graphics drivers found that he could eke out improved turnaround on frame flipping, i.e. sending a picture to the screen to be displayed by having the writer for the next frame trail the reader for the frame before it as they scan the same block of memory. So, at any given time, that block of memory would actually contain portions of 2 or more separate frames, and the only thing keeping the pictures looking right was the fact that he could assume one piece of code would never catch up to the other. A lot of modern computer programming is using the correct pattern for the problem, but depending on the specifics of the problem, sometimes the right pattern is not the best solution. And even when it is, there are small implementation details and choices that can make or break it. Been writing and designing software for almost 40 years. I've seen a lot of best practices that actually aren't, but one that always is. Don't waste time, not the user's time, not the computer's time, and if possible, not your time. Story 3. Oh man, I worked with lots of servers at my old job, very big company. My title was System Administrator, but what I actually did was far from it. I was more on the software side for a very specific program. Most of the work orders we got was to set this program up, something we've done a million times. So some people would take their time with those work orders and say it took them 10 minutes to complete one, which in all fairness was a good baseline. If you could do one server in a few minutes, most requests had like 3 servers. I made scripts to automate my work, so one server would take me 10 seconds, depending on the network. I used my scripts over and over again. I was by far the laziest person there, but I did 90% of the work. They loved me. Well, like all giant tech companies, they laid off 100,000 people. There were like 450,000 people working at the company, and this was pre-2020. And so my workload increased significantly. Not only did the amount of work requests increase, but we also had to learn a new product, one that works with our program. One of our biggest accounts threw work orders at us that had hundreds of servers on a single request. Not only was that annoying, but onboarding for this account took half a year. There were only 2 people on the account at the time, so we were getting buried in work. I ended up making my pride and joy script. This script not only did all the work with our original scope of work, but it also did all the work for the new product as well. When I coded that script, I made sure to add how long it took to complete the work. I think on average, it was like 7 minutes from start to finish for one work order, whereas without automation, it would take the whole week, if not longer. I only did it so I wouldn't have to work as hard. I had it down to a science. I would wake up at 5, log into my work computer at 6, crank the volume, right-click the screen, worked on Linux. Right-clicking would prevent the screensaver from coming up, locking my computer and showing me as away. I went back to bed. If anyone pinged me, I could hear it. I would usually wake up and actually look at emails around 10. Work smarter, not harder, people. Nice, very nice. Writing a shell script to do a thing must be like the best feeling in the world. Besides waking up at 10, of course. Story 4. I'm a high school physics teacher, and I found that when you're training because your mentors teach you based on their experience, you find that a lot of their rules don't apply, and a lot of teaching staples are complete nonsense. For example, teachers swear by the idea that you should have a red, amber, green level system to your questions. So the weak kids can do red and the top tier kids do green. But why should the weak kids do red? Why can't they do amber? What you and I need to do as a teacher to get them doing green. And it's almost like saying you're not smart enough to do the top stuff. Another example is learning styles. Research shows that the idea that people are visual or kinesthetic learners is absolutely lies. But 91% of teachers or something similar believe in it. When actually it's not true at all, and you do more harm because children believe that's the only way they'll learn. I think the misconception comes from the fact that while students may have a preferred learning style, that doesn't mean they may only learn in that particular style. Sure, a student may prefer a kinesthetic style of information processing, but it's not always feasible for certain subjects. For example, my subject specialism is physics. Certain topics are more abstract and can't be taught that way. Therefore, are we to suggest that they can't learn it? Absolutely not. Rather than an exclusive method of information deliverance, we should be focusing on dual coding, first hypothesized by Pavio in 1971 method, using two of these learning channels side by side to help effectively double the learning input. By presenting information both visually and orally, students effectively receive twice the information they would otherwise and are more likely to retain the information, assuming the appropriate retrieval practice and being cautious to not cognitively overload them. So, what does work? There are lots of cheap methods of teaching that help students learn. I'm based in England, so obviously, depending on where you are in the world, my resources may require cultural translation. The EEF, an independent charity dedicated to breaking the link between family income and educational achievement, compare loads of practices and link their costs with their effective gain in learning, as well as compare how secure the research is in that field. And the ones that I tend to use most in my practice as a teacher are metacognition, explicitly teaching students to understand their own learning and their own thought process while learning or retrieving information. I could go on for days about this, and there's a lot more to this than I can go into in one paragraph, so feel free to ask if you'd like me to expand, which has lots of secure research and can show an 8-month increase in learning. Dual coding, the idea of using two learning channels which teach new content. So incorporating verbal instruction with appropriate visual, helpful aids, really easy to overload students with poor visual cues. Retrieval practice, strategic recall practice, getting students to practice recalling information. Practicing something more helps you remember. Go figure, right? And yet teachers don't tend to do it enough. It's like one lesson on this, next lesson on this, with no links or questions about the previous topic. So I might teach about kinetic energy on day 1, gravitational energy on day 2, but on day 2, I will have questions on kinetic energy or questions linking in the two topics. In space practice, asking them questions on topics they learned a day ago, a few days ago, a week ago, a few weeks ago, leaving more and more time between next quizzing them so they can practice remembering it and retrieving the information. Story 5. I'm a writer. Contrary to what most folks on the internet would tell you, how you write is incredibly important. In fact, the way in which something is written often matters more than the contents of the words themselves. Consider the following sentence. Steve looked into the restaurant and saw a man devouring chicken. With the inclusion of a single hyphen, we get something completely different. Steve looked into the restaurant and saw a man devouring chicken. That's just one example. Here's another. His eyes went wide. Come on, people, he shouted. If we omit that vocative comma, which so many people do, we get this. His eyes went wide. Come on, people, he shouted. As you can see, that single comma prevented quite a mess. You get the point by now. It's absolutely essential to know the fundamental rules which govern the written word. Unfortunately, you have to already know them before you can appreciate why they're so important, meaning that many folks never bother to learn them and never get the full benefit from whatever they read. After all, a lot of those rules seem contradictory or confusing on the surface, and many people believe like they have better things to do than figure out why "its" isn't actually an exception to the mandate about possessive apostrophes. Here's the thing though, once a person is an absolutely perfect writer, they can make use of language's inherent nuances and eccentricities to great effect. One of my favorite examples of this showed up in Douglas Adams's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. For example, it's unpleasantly like being drunk. What's so unpleasant about being drunk? You ask a glass of water. Put another way, a bad writer can describe a man devouring chicken, a good writer can describe a man devouring chicken, and a good writer who's intentionally channeling a bad one can describe a man being intoxicated. I'll let you decide what role the chicken played in that last clause. Writing well isn't all that difficult, but it does require that a person be focused on what they're doing. Conversely, writing poorly is incredibly easy, and it can be done almost absent-mindedly. When a person is dedicating more attention to what they're saying than how they're saying it, mistakes tend to creep in, and having those mistakes called out can feel strangely like an attack on both the intended content and the writer as an individual. Following that, I've seen a lot of excuse-based cognitive dissonance being embraced and even encouraged by would-be writers. Rather than attempting to improve, they try to rationalize their bad habits, going so far as to spread misinformation. When those rationalizations are challenged, the same "I'm being hurt" response arises, prompting people to view advice as being inherently negative in nature. You've likely seen that last part quite a bit. Even in professional settings, I've had writers angrily accuse me, someone who was literally being paid to proofread their work, of trying to belittle them by fixing their errors. Some of those folks haven't even tried to claim that certain things aren't errors. Like when one fellow insisted that "there" was possessive because it contained an apostrophe. In short, it's easier and more pleasant for a lot of people to say either "that isn't a mistake" or "yeah, well, it doesn't matter," than it is for them to hone their skills. Those people then cause other folks to make similar errors and the cycle repeats. They amplify one another on social media sites, they offer arguments that they don't actually understand, and they get angry as part of a defense mechanism. Personally, I really appreciate corrections. They give me the chance to fix mistakes that would have otherwise gone unaddressed, and given the choice between leaving errors in place or fixing them, I'll always choose the latter. Alright, so for anyone who doesn't get the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy example from before, drunk is the past participle of drink. Drunk also means inebriated or intoxicated. So when the first speaker says it's unpleasantly like being drunk, the second speaker assumes that the latter definition is being used. The reader is goaded into the same assumption by way of how being drunk was written. The humor arises from the first speaker's mention of a glass of water, which causes a sudden shift in one's interpretation. Story 6. I make bespoke clothing. Usually it doesn't involve design. I'm a terrible designer. But it does involve a lot of creative problem solving because part of why clothing designed for one person looks terrible on another person comes down to the quote-unquote rules of fit and construction. Ergo, if I want to make something to spec that will fit and flatter my client and not make them look like a duck in a trash bag, I have to know how clothing is put together in order to know where I can hack and arrange the pattern in order to get it work. Where to add, subtract, change shape, raise, lower, rearrange entirely only works when you know why it worked in the first place. Now take it up a notch. Cosplay. Video game designers drawing and animating costumes that do not work the way they work in animation, and now someone wants it to be real and fit their body. The amount of problem solving involved would break a lesser man. Now you're throwing not just the rules of making clothing into it, but the laws of physics. Knowing what will still work if you fiddle with it and what will absolutely not work because the laws of physics sadly cannot be broken is right up Picasso's alley. Can I dye plastic with RIT dye? Surprisingly, maybe. Can I dye wet look PVC vinyl? Absolutely not. Can I build this coat without having any visible stitching on the outside? Damn right I can. Can I make the skirt look like it's floating and also hide the zipper? Probably, but it's going to cost you. Imagine, to make the skirt look like it's floating while also hiding the zipper, the first thing to do is to determine how much fabric should ideally go into it. The super swishy floating effect in a lot of art and animation is exaggerated. It's not usually ideal for anyone's budget to put 12 yards of fabric into a skirt. Plus, the more fabric there is, the heavier the whole thing will be. And without an understructure, the skirt will simply flop straight down and drag on the floor. The decision can be helped along by the length of the skirt, the pattern, and how to add sneaky features. Yards and yards of rectangles gathered into a waistband is one way, sure, but it's heavy and thick and doesn't always flow right. Circle skirts or gourd skirts also work to add volume without adding fabric. After that, an understructure helps to keep things up, but understructures, panners, crinolines, etc., have to be hidden unless having it show is part of your design or aesthetic. Also consider the type of fabric because a light rayon or chiffon will behave differently from linen or wool or even satin. There are a lot of different factors to balance, but the benefit is that gives you a lot of places to try new tricks or hide the way it was built so that, to the untrained eye, it looks like magic. Story 7. I work at a prevention site, and for those who don't know, it's exactly what it sounds like, a site people can do drugs at, and if they we revive them using Narcan. And with that being said, a million policies are in place so that these sites can exist. Most people hate substance users and don't understand misuse is really just a side effect of the first world. Not that it doesn't exist in other countries, just significantly less, and Western societies are actually quite robotic and industrial. It makes sense why some people are on substances. Anyways, half the time the people who work at these places come from their own experience, so when you're reviving life after life and breaking policy to meet the needs of other people, you kind of come to this thorough understanding that we're all just insignificant specks experiencing profoundly significant moments. And as someone who won't be remembered and works through an industry made up of policies, my only real goal in life is to support the complex and fluctuating process of the human experience. That's beautifully breaking the rules to me, I suppose. Story 8. I work in construction, specifically RF equipment, as a CAD designer, coordinator, etc., etc. Now, before this job, I was well aware of and had previous experience with engineering and technical drawing since I dropped out of mech engineering since it wasn't to my liking, and worked as a CNC machine operator, so lots of exposure to metrology and standards, etc. I worked in a similar position in the electrical trade for a while, and there were decent standards established, and they were definitely important to learn because partners and customers expect compliant drawings at all times. Simple things like how to show conduit on the concrete floor, routing up above the floor are well established and pretty much the same drawing from job to job, etc. A 2-inch galv, 90-degree elbow poke through, etc. Blah, it's boring but reliable and efficient. However, when I get to the RF telecom side of the same industry, it's like the Wild West, since basically anything to do with telecom companies is cancer, or maybe since the industry is still pretty new versus electrical service work. The drawings everyone makes are ugly. They will pass permitting, but good luck when your field guys go to install. And I can't imagine looking a customer in the eyes and handing them such trash. Anyway, I got lucky and was given all but complete freedom from my management to bringing our drawings, complete drawing sets, from cover page to symbols chosen to fonts and scales, etc. All the diagrams, all the details, literally everything has been my task for the last several years. Goodbye awful varying don't types and sizes, salmon and beige color combinations and yellow lines and white backgrounds, never again. It's been a long process, but we now get real compliments from customers on how clear and modern our drawing packages are. I suspect at some point we can attribute a sale to word of mouth, at least stemming from how nice I made it all look. Talk about value. Many telecom companies don't even provide engineering spec drawings for their equipment. Think interior, exterior antennas, large wall or floor-mounted equipment. I often end up 3D modeling the equipment using images and overall bounding dimensions, just to then regenerate 2D views of the equipment with mounting equipment, etc. for details. Not many companies that size would be willing to pay the CAD guy this much time to revamp this much. I've also revamped the entire engineering team's markup process and tools to match the newly implemented CAD standards, so across the board, we all expect the same high quality end product. This sort of thing takes a while to build up, but I am positive that the edge we are gaining over our competitors is getting pretty damn sharp with regard to how much drawings end up mattering as a whole. Story 9. Primary care doctor in the US here. I strongly disapprove of insurance companies and this ridiculous private insurance system. I won't go into debate into the politics of M4A or why I agree with a single payer option here. I answered that question a couple of weeks ago, so anyone can look in my history for it. Anyway, not that I particularly enjoy having to dedicate brain power to manipulating insurance companies, but a clever PCP, or any doc really, will know exactly how to maneuver around insurance company silly, stupid, incredibly frustrating rules in order to get things covered. Here's a dumb example, but I hope it gets my point across. You come in because you have a little growth on your neck. It's been there for years, it's not changing. I look at it and pretty immediately know it's a benign lesion. For example, seborrheic keratosis or something. Well, unfortunately for you, insurance won't pay for a cosmetic procedure to take something off. They only want to pay for a biopsy. Well, maybe I ask you if it ever gets itchy and bleeds when you scratch it. Yes? Excellent. I now know exactly how I need to document this lesion in order for insurance to not stick you with a $200 bill for me to take it off. That's a completely arbitrary example that I'm simplifying a ton. Also, I'm in absolutely zero way saying you go to your doctor and flat out lie. I'm not endorsing insurance fraud on either the doctor or the patient's behalf. I'm only saying that there are a ton of incredibly frustrating hoops insurance companies manufacture in the name of bureaucracy that serve no purpose in good medical care. And a good doctor or pharmacist or nurse will learn the tricks of the trade to satisfy these hoops. This goes the same for medical prescribing. Also, I use a lot of templates. Well, if you're enjoying the video and learning a thing or two so far from these, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like button for more videos just like this. Story 10. I'm a forklift operator, loading and unloading LTL freight. We are always told the driver needs to be able to move every skid with his pallet jack. Turning a standard pallet sideways saves about 8 inches of floor space that I might need later. I found that in most cases, once the trailer is backed up to the customer, if they can't move the skid 95 out of 100 times, they are fine cutting the shrink wrap and unloading by hand. I try not to pick anything super heavy or that has too many boxes, but every skid that I make fit on a trailer is another stop for the driver and money in his pocket. And the consignee gets their stuff. Maybe it's a nursing home getting some basic supplies or a bike shop getting some bikes, but they all want their stuff. Story 11. In cosmetology, there's so many instances of this practice. When it comes to coloring hair, we have to use color theory, application, the effect of metamerism, maintaining the hair, fabric's integrity, and so much more. When doing highlights on someone, you have to take into account how to deal with color placement angles. To do well, you have to understand how a flat line will fall on a round surface in a medium that moves. You have to understand chemistry well enough not to put an industrial-grade oxidizing agent, lightener, aka bleach, on someone and control it by the way you mix and time it to get your desired end results. And that's just the start of color. When it comes to cutting, different elevations create different effects of which we call geometric shapes. When done well, the living sculpture you create is made by artfully yet strategically lifting and over-directing hair away from where it naturally falls and removing hair. And that's just scissor work. Add clippers or a razor in and it's a new set of skills. The investment that you make on a personal service is really paying for the skill of the provider's time spent on mastering their craft. Story 12. I'm a retired semi-pro touring kickboxer and cage fighter. I was essentially what is known as a can crusher. I was often placed in unsanctioned freak show bouts against large dudes who were either athletes or thought they were super tough, cops, ex-military, frat bros, that type. They were freak show bouts because I am very small. I am 5'2", built at 5 feet, and normally weighed about 135 to 150 pounds. I'm a second-degree black belt in ninjutsu, a Muay Thai crew, and a yellow glove saboteur. All 3 of these ranks are instructor level. I was also a medal-winning wrestler in school and have experience in judo, BJJ, and pankration. Most of the guys that I fought had zero concept of defense and had no answer for being hit. They had no idea how to deal with an opponent who moved, dodged, and timed counter hits. They did not know how to defend themselves. They did not know how to react to a jab hook or a teep kick or being grabbed. Sometimes I'd come across a sandbagging black belt and we'd have a war and then usually go out to drink. 66 of my 78 wins were officially by knockout, but a lot of those KOs were striking-induced referee stoppages, largely because ground and pound gets people seriously hurt. I miss it now that I'm retired. Story 13. I'm a professional editor and motion design artist, After Effects, Premiere, Cinema 4D, DaVinci Resolve. When I first started using After Effects, you had to render out every effect and bring it into an editing system to even know what you had. I got really good at knowing if something should take 10 frames or 12 frames or a whole second to animate a certain way because the redo was painful every time I got it wrong, and drive space cost a premium. That was 20 years ago, and currently you can do live previews in After Effects as you design, so that pain is largely gone. But I can see an effect in a movie or online and know immediately how fast it should be and how to replicate it and often make it better. I spent so many thousands of hours learning my craft, and I often wish I'd known back then half of the stuff I know now. I can do a commercial edit and a whole graphics package for it in the time it would have taken me to do one title when I started. I cringe at some of the awful stuff I did by trial and error, but now I just know what's going to feel right and look right. They say you can't learn taste, but you can. And after a while, you learn to have a restraint, and that is probably the most important ingredient to making great film and video deliverables. Story 14. This is a bit of a stretch, but weightlifting and powerlifting are both great examples of this. I'm a strength coach and a casual powerlifter, and I constantly see new athletes trying to emulate the greats in their various disciplines because they have a similar build or simply because, quote, if it works for them, it must work for me. When it comes to skill-specific sports about moving a lot of weight in a straight line, the fundamentals exist for a reason, because they work. Newcomers tend to want to skip through all the hard work and become a carbon copy of another lifter thinking that emulating their form will make them great. The accomplished lifter, in 100% of cases, spends thousands of hours and thousands upon thousands of repetitions hammering the basics. Over time, as their expertise grew, they made suboptimal adaptations and tweaks that wouldn't necessarily work for everyone, but through experience they found are optimal for them. Story 15. Building stages and sets for concerts and theater events is an exercise in here's the instructions on how to build it, now fix everything that's wrong and modify it to fit the space. Being a stagehand means being proficient in electronics, carpentry, sound design, painting, minor mechanical engineering, welding, plumbing, radio communications, and a litany of computer systems. And you have to learn quickly to take your basic knowledge of these things and pivot quickly in order to make things work. I've made all sorts of cable adapters, used miles of gaff tape to fix light leaks or cover up something shiny, filed and carved and hacked away with a saw to make a set piece fit properly, gotten very creative with rigging equipment in order to hold something up out of the way, covered a lot of mistakes with acres of Duvin, and I like the idea of breaking the rules like an artist because all of it is art. I miss my job, I can't wait for restrictions to lift and get back to playing with my giant Lego sets. Story 16. I'm a correctional officer. You never turn your back on an inmate. Never be alone without a partner in sight. Never put yourself in a vulnerable situation. Good advice, I almost always follow it. But these are people. I've put myself in a position where a criminal absolutely could have gotten the jump on me, fully aware of what I was doing and that I could give an order or stand somewhere else or call for another CO in order to keep myself safer. I have taken those chances on purpose in select circumstances in a display of trust. I've let men who have committed horrible acts come into my personal space and communicate with them one-on-one, with my back turned to other offenders, trusting them to warn me with eye contact if anyone sneaks up on me. I've absolutely crossed the line about personal interactions, knowing I'm keeping my integrity and that I'm monitoring myself, and that in the few chances that I get to actually help in this messed up system, I'm giving support and encouragement. Letting a guy make a phone call to his lady when I know he's hurting, even though it's not allowed at the moment, isn't going to hurt him, the institution, or me. But I am careful and didn't start out my career doing this. I was very, very careful when I started, and I'm constantly checking myself, encouraging my coworkers to let me know if they think I'm putting myself in danger, and I know I always need to be ready to make adjustments. Story 17. I myself am not a pro, but I have some experience in the field and I've spoken a lot with those who are actual pros, but my first thought was penetration testing and ethical hacking is a broad topic. People want to get into hacking because they've seen it in movies and they think it's super cool, and it definitely can be. But you're not going to become a hacker yourself until you learn a lot of skills that can be seemingly unrelated at first. If you spend enough time going through hacker forums and talking to guys who have worked in the industry, there's some advice you start to consistently hear that runs right along the same lines as the question. You're oftentimes told to become a proficient programmer, especially when it comes to reading and comprehending others' code, and you're told to experiment with and break stuff. Find a cool program on GitHub? Cool, now download it and see how you can manipulate it beyond its intended purpose. That's a very loose example, but it speaks to the heart of hacker ideology, where the goal is to be driven to see how programs and tools can be exploited beyond their intended purpose, and how one technology can be combined with another to achieve an unexpected and sometimes fun and/or dangerous result. When people think of a hacker, they think of the dude in a black hoodie in a dark room typing away on his laptop at 200 words per minute while a green and black terminal goes out line after line of code. But in reality, most hackers sit pretty quietly at a computer and think a lot about how something can be manipulated, or they just downright start playing with things and through lots of trial and error, they eventually achieve their end goal. But to do any of this requires a lot of knowledge in various fields. You kind of have to be a jack of all trades to be truly successful in the field. Take what I've said with a grain of salt because I just enjoy playing around with CTFs and I'm not a professional penetration tester, just a computer science student. Story 18. I work as a visual effects supervisor and I think this idea is core to how we work. Our job is essentially to recreate reality and often to make unbelievable things be believable. The more we understand how the real world works, the more believable are the unreal effects we create for screen. I advise all students learning VFX to learn about how real cameras work and to learn how to light and photograph objects. These are fundamental to recreating things in CG where we're constantly observing the world through a lens. Things like vignetting, chromatic aberration, lens distortion, depth of field, and exposure are key to recreating photographic images. Knowing what lenses do to faces and space and how cinematic cameras are mounted and moved can make our CG camera moves feel more real. For animators, I always suggest they learn 2D animation and dancing or martial arts. 2D animation teaches you how to draw in weight and timing. You have to really think about those aspects when you draw them yourself. And 2D animation also teaches planning and observation of motion. Dancing or martial arts teaches you about weight and analyzing your own motion, which helps when you need to analyze movement. When doing FX and CG explosions, it's important to understand physics and how fuel combusts and ignites, or how friction and forces like tensile strength operate. This allows us to apply real-world rules to things that are unreal. For example, if we need to make a dragon, we need to think about it as a real-world thing. The modelers and concept artists needs to understand the anatomy of flying creatures and the applications of reptilian skin. The FX artists need to think about how the dragon's fire is made, in its belly or from glands in its mouth like we did on GOT. The animators need to understand how birds fly, what muscles move, and how they trigger during flight while seeing the differences in lizards and other low-to-ground four-legged creatures, as well as things like nictitating membranes for the eyes, how lips work on snouts, dog reference is a good one here, and all sorts of things. Creature FX artists then simulate the skin and fat and muscles and membranes between the wings. Lighting artists need to understand the telltale signs of the rough leather or scales on the back versus the smooth, rubbed leather under the joints. Lighters need to understand subsurface properties of leather, how to expose a camera for a creature in the sky while still reading detail in the fire, and the creative needs to be able to pick out the eyes of a creature. The compositors bring all those things together. So basically, their job is to be excellent visual liars, right? Story 19. I work in geotechnical engineering, and you would not believe how many buildings are built on, yeah, that's probably okay, or yeah, that should be fine. Basically, almost everything these days, at least in developed nations with building codes, is highly over-engineered. Experienced engineers know what will actually cause a structure to fail, so they let things go outside the rules that are written on paper sometimes because what's written is probably accounting for loads way higher than needed. Sometimes, not all the time. Small buildings, houses, strip malls, wood buildings, etc. don't weigh as much as you might think, and heavy buildings, multi-story steel and concrete buildings, skyscrapers, etc. weigh much more than you might think. Story 20. Weird to say as a social worker, but there are a lot of gray areas in policy. One area I did was in how I dealt with runaway foster youth for my agency. The policy, basically, is if a youth runs, you call the cops, file a juvenile petition, and make some half-ass efforts to find them. That didn't sit well for me because I felt the overriding duty was to ensure their safety, no matter what. So when I had a runner, I always gave them my personal cell and taught them how to get in touch with me by restricted numbers or on social media. All I asked is that they check in and tell me if they're okay. There were times they would disclose where they were, and I delivered food and clothes without turning them in or telling my boss. This built trust, and I was always able to work out directly with them a place they felt okay staying, or help them understand some consequences don't go away and they needed to face up to that. I'm very proud to say that when I began those tactics that I single-handedly reduced out percentage of runaway youth from 25% to 0% within a year. A decade later, it's rare for us to even have a runaway because I was able to educate my colleagues, officers, and judges on how to prevent them in the first place. Story 21. When I was in the military, my platoon sergeant told me that, quote, your worst followers will be your best leaders. And IDK, but he was right. When I became a squad leader and had new problem soldiers that were always messing up and getting in trouble for breaking the rules and needing disciplinary action, I would punish them by putting them in a leadership position, i.e. like a team leader or assistant team leader, and giving them a lot of responsibilities all at once. Sure enough, they really stepped up to the plate every time. I'm talking like an overnight coin flip, complete 180-degree turnaround. All of a sudden, they are the first ones at work in the morning, their rooms are spotless, they really beef up on their battle drills and general knowledge. Dude's got 3 whole FMs and the Ranger Handbook memorized and he wants to drop a whole SF packet. I really think it's because the guys just really are born to lead and putting them at the bottom is a real struggle for them. But once you put them where they belong, they really shine, and I think that could be said about leaders in any profession. Thinking back, I remember when I was a new soldier, I got in trouble a lot for talking back and disrespect, and I was a private E1 for a long time, lol. But I really started to shine performance-wise when we got a new platoon sergeant, and he, instead of just messing me up all the time like the other ones and me acting out even more as an act of rebellion, he actually sat me down and talked to me. And I remember really appreciating that and not wanting to disappoint him as a way of saying thank you. Story 22. In medicine, there are countless guidelines that are published that help direct almost algorithmically what you should do for a given disease. These guidelines are based on peer-reviewed articles that show proven benefit for particular patients of that given disease. This also directs how medical insurance justifies paying for treatment that is ordered for a patient. However, the data that creates the guidelines are population-based and thus don't account for the outliers of the patient population, or sometimes you have a hunch you need to do something a little extra or test for something off the beaten trail because what you see in your patient doesn't fit with other patients that normally follow these treatment algorithms. And then you have to go through the hassle of justifying this to insurance companies, etc. Story 23. In music, you learn how to master time, or the beats within a minute, BPM, aka tempo, the subdivision of time. When you learn how to feel the space and time rhythmically, you then can begin to introduce pulling and pushing of the tempo. The only way to describe what is then happening is influencing the listener's perception of time. They are now feeling a faster song as you increase your tempo to also increase heated emotions or excitement. The opposite occurs as you drag time and pull it back. Once you are a pro, you phrase songs in conventional 4/4 time signature and then introduce verses or bridges in odd time signatures like 5/4, which is a totally different effect to tempo changes. A time signature change to me is an attitude change of the song. You can tell it's the same song as the chord progressions and melodies are the same, but now something is off about the song. It starts looping at an unexpected point, which then animates in a totally original way. I can show my own original songs in which I incorporated all of these sorts of effects and make it fluid where you really are breaking the rules like an artist. Story 24. Clinical psychologist here, becoming a pro, 14 years of university in psychology, undergrad, the equivalent of 2 masters and the PhD, countless books, countless journal articles, several practicum placements at leading hospitals, more than half a dozen supervisors, breaking the rules, learning when to say nothing with your words but a lot with your body language. Surprisingly, that's rarely taught in clinical psych. Learning when to share your own or life experience, typically a big no-no because the session can quickly become all about you. Learning when and how to make someone comfortable by being unprofessional, for example, cursing with a teenager. Learning to sit in silence when almost every course suggests that you quote-unquote reflect what a client says. There is more artistry in the work than I could have ever imagined. I would never do any other job. Story 25. Prior to 2020, I worked in a rock climbing gym for 3 years as a route setter. We put the plastic wooden shapes on the walls of climbing gyms in certain orientations so that they are climbable with a specific level of difficulty. This really is the golden rule. When new setters start out, everyone wants to set something unique to their preferred style of climbing or set something super complex and flashy looking, big jumping dynos or very delicate balancy no-hands climbing. The result is usually something awkward or unsafe to climb or both. Still, the head setters at my old work like to give new setters chances to try those types of things so that they can get a sense of all the little things that they overlook when trying too hard to force a certain type of climbing. From there, we have them set easier climbs for newer climbers. Essentially, the rock climbing equivalent of a semi-interesting ladder. Left hand, left foot, right foot type of climbing. It's going to feel lame and boring and too easy, but it's when you're making easier routes that you learn fundamentals like, oh, I don't need to make the hold in the right hand worse to make the move harder. I can just move the foot to the left 8 inches and that forces them to put all their body weight on this side of their body, or whatever. All the tiny micro adjustments that you can make that can entirely change the moveset required to climb the route. Route setting is 50% science and 50% art form. I miss route setting more than anything in the whole world. Story 26. Learning how plants work can go long ways to growing amazing food, planting trees, etc. I'm converting my lawn into a forest of food and wildlife habitat. Just an example, grasses like bacterial-dominated soils, but trees want fungal-dominated soils. So converting your grass into a forest or planting a tree on a lawn is typically a really bad way to go about it. However, if you want a new tree to do really well, you can start by converting the soil. Smother the grass with cardboard, put down a full foot of wood chips, let that sit for a solid year. The mushrooms will decompose the wood chips and build fungal-dominated soil. Now, when you plant your tree, it will absolutely take off and do very well. I have many videos in my post history on how to cheat at gardening using science. There is really no such thing as a brown thumb, just a green thumb who is working against nature and not with nature. Nature is the green thumb. We just have to listen to her and speak her language and let her do all the work. What used to be my lawn is now thousands of plants in a forest-style garden with a giant ecosystem pond smack dab in the middle. And if you liked any of these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.